where we empower Kanaka to utilize our national archive. And I am part of Ōlelo Hawaiʻi o Honolulu. And Ōlelo Hawaiʻi is an internationalist, anti-imperial, anti-colonial, and specifically anti-American political organization, which started in 1893. The Honolulu chapter is really well known for having many of the scholars and organizers being intimate with the poʻe aliʻi, right? Because right across the street is Kahale o Iolani, which is Iolani Palace. Arian Hall, which is now the USPS, across the street from Iolani Palace, is one of the first places where organizing by wahine takes place in Ōlelo Hawaiʻi. And in that first month after the overthrow, Ōlelo Hawaiʻi o Nālede, and particularly the group in Honolulu, organized to get 500 wahine into Ariona Hall. And in that space, they start to plot, they start to direct people and start to organize around this idea of anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, and anti-capitalism, all for the betterment of all of Hawaii, ko Hawaii Pai'aina, the Hawaiian archipelago. Okay. And so my name's Kauwila Mahi. I have spent the last decade or so as a researcher in archival materials. I've worked as an interpreter for nations all across Turtle Island, some including the Shingle Springs Miwok, people throughout Gunwage, or what is now known as Montreal, people throughout Alberta, and all of this research, all of these kokua, all of this has been my effort towards building solidarity with other nations and having nation-to-nation relationships through Ōlelo Hawaiʻi. And so I've worked for University of Alberta, University of Concordia, University of Texas, and University of
the Hawaiian National Archive.
Sorry. Okay. And so most of the work I do revolves around pre-colonial governance. What did our aliʻi do? How did they govern? How do we talk about kapu and kanawai? And then all of this research has also informed how we build political futures rooted in oiwi past, right? So how do we think about our future and pushing our past forward rather than staying quote unquote stuck in the past, and how these things overlap and intertwine with one another. And for the past 2 years, I've been the head GRA, or graduate research assistant, at the Waihona Palapala Punio Kamoko Aino Hawaii, the Hawaiʻi State Archives, where I've overseen many graduate students and undergraduate students through their process of learning how to interpret, how to do research, and how to have conversations around topics like aina, aliʻi, and moʻi. So the title of today's talk story is Kahiko, Adornments of Antiquity. And yeah, that's me, Kauwila Mahi. Hi. And so I'm gonna start off actually with a mele. And this mele is one that my mom taught me when I was young. And I'll explain this image through the mele. Okay. Hele hoʻi ke ala mauka o ka u. Hele hoʻi ke ala makai o punei. O ka ma'e la o ka pualeʻi. Aloha ka piʻina i kukala ulai. O puka kula i ka puʻulena. Aina ke akua e nohoi. O ka umagana i o ka leo. Ka leo ole nui. So this mele is a mele noi komo, to enter in the space or the vicinity, the time-space relation with Pele. And it is a mele that is passed down by most hula traditions throughout Hawaii. The image that you see is actually in Kilauea, and there's 3 images that are overlapped. The base layer that you can see over here is Halima'u Ma'u. And the reason you can see people overlapping is because this is a space of ceremony. My mother, who was a photographer in the 1990s, was a Hawaiian sovereignty photographer, and she shot a lot of photos revolving around protests and Hawaiian sovereignty. And so that's one of the layers that you see to the left. And the layer that you see to the right was actually a still shot from Le Maile Barrett, who is a hoa of mine that has been on the front lines of digital media related to Aloha Aina and what's going on in Hawaii. And the reason I started off with this mele is to kind of shift the space that we're in, to think about archives in a different way than most people think about archives. And so the method, the way I tell stories, comes from my tutu. My tutu, Gertrude Lillian Tollefson Mahi. She is from Molokai, and she is a really famous lei maker, actually, from Maui, or she lives on Maui for roughly 30 years after moving off of Molokai. And the reason she became a famous lei maker is because she'll go to swap meets and kind of hustle her lei. But one of the ways that people know her is because from the 1980s to the 1990s, she was the sole lei maker for Kamehameha School's Kapalama song contest. Yeah, so she made all the lei that you see from the 1980s to the 1990s, and that was how she made her living for a year. And so my method of storytelling, my method of sharing ike comes from her, and comes from actually a long line of matriarchs in my ohana who are scholars who have been on the front lines of many different movements and preserving ike Hawaii. And so another way to put it is oka makila ana oka lei oka otutu, how my tutu would like string together lei with makila, which is a specific term to Maui for stringing lei together. In the same way that manai is one of the ways that is said in ceremony. I like to take different resources, different sources of ike, in the same way traditional hulu lei maker would take certain feathers from one manu and let it free, and then take certain feathers from another manu, let it free, in order to make lei hulu, in order to gift it to you, the people who are here today listening to this mo'olelo, to this little story about how to access archives and how we use them. And so this is going to be the trek of today. We're going to talk a little bit about what is an archive. How do we prostrate ourselves to our aliʻi and to aina? Art as a motif for change, and how to transition these things like archival materials into arts and contemporary art. Specifically, I'm going to focus on streetwear and mele. And then the last thing is going to be ho'alu inakini, gathering the multitudes, or how to use these resources. So, what is an archive? Ho'omaka paha wau me ke ia haʻi ōlelo, ke ia palapala atikala, ana Joseph ho'ona'awa o Kanepu'u. So I'm going to start with a little quote by this person, Joseph ho'ona'awa o Kanepu'u. And basically, the premise for this quote, e maki ana ka hanau na Hawaii, ona la ade umikuma walu kana hiku, a me ade umikuma walu kana walu, a me ade umikuma walu kana iwa, a me ade umikuma aiva kana aiva, ike ia mau mo'olelo. Yeah, so in 1862, there is a portion of a mele that a kau that is part of the mo'olelo of Hi'iakai Kapolio Pele that is omitted by the editor Kapihenui of this newspaper Kahoku Kapaki Pika. And on this publication, on this date, in October 30th, 1862, on the first page, Joseph Ho'ona'awa o Kanepu'u bemoans the fact that this is going to be omitted. And in fact, he argues that generations of Hawaiians in 1870, 1880 1890, and the 1990s are going to want these mo'olelo, these stories, the chants in their entirety. And so I want us to think about how already different that is from how we think about our mo'olelo and the scarcity of our mo'olelo. It's quite the opposite. People like Joseph Ho'ona'oa Kanepu'u and many others who are writing into Atikala Nupepa, it could be your kupuna, your own kupuna. They wrote these letters so that they could carve space for us to ensure that we know the mo'olelo that they're sharing. So in a sense, they carved out a future for us to know and to hold us in the future that they were creating. Yeah, and so this foresight, this vanana, this vision that Kanepu'u has is for 130 years down the line. And so this is already a radically different future than what was being imagined typically at the time. A lot of people, rightfully so, were thinking about the detriment and the loss of Po'e Hawaiʻi, the population collapse that happens inside of the 19th century or the 1800s. And Kanepu'u does too. But at the same time, he wants to ensure that everybody who writes into these Nupepa carve out a pu'uhonua, a safe space, in order for these mo'olelo, these kau, these kanikau, all of these sounds that are in print to have a life beyond just a newspaper, to have a life 130 years in the future. And so this article was actually dusted off by Kumu Noinoi Silva in her book, Power of the Steel Tip Pen. And it is becoming more ingrained into how we think about Indigenous futures, especially Hawaii's future. Okay. And so the way I want to also shift how we talk about archival materials is to think about how we talk about archives as visual and as material, so feeling it, but really thinking about what we're reading and making ear witnessing and focusing on orality. Yeah, so this is a quote by Noilani Arista, where she states, "My work here is oriented towards describing what is the Hawaiian language archive and how you might interpret and modify our approaches to a native language archives as sites of traditional and empirical knowledge. In addition, I suggest an archival praxis based on ear witnessing and orality." Okay, so ear witnessing means listening, and so when we listen to archival materials, we're guided, or we look through what is being printed, what is being written down, what is being documented, and not just thinking about it as something that can't have life beyond the page. If you look at archival materials, especially older ones, you actually do need, at least in the Hawaiian language, you do need a certain understanding of orality to the point, especially at early documents between the 1790s and the 1850s, similar to that of a moʻolelo, an indigenous speaker of Ōlelo Hawaiʻi. And the reason you need this orality piece, aside from knowing that orality was the way where we created kapu and kanawai, or what we dictate today as law, but to really understand, sometimes letters are omitted on pages that you wouldn't be able to catch if you didn't have that skill set of a traditional speaker. But that isn't to say that you can't get to that point. It's just to say that it helps a lot when you have this oral piece, or think about archival materials as not only something that you're viewing or looking at or eyewitnessing. Okay. And so I'm going to ask all of you, he lehua ka lehua. What is a lehua? How do we think about lehua? Can one or two people talk back what you think a lehua is, or what you think a function of a lehua is? You can turn off your mic. Give it another second. What is a lehua?
Practically, it can be it's a flower.
Good. Yeah, mahalo. Practically, it can be a flower. Does anybody else have any mana'o?
Yeah, so I heard that back in the day before contact with Europeans that there were a group of warriors that were called Lehua and Evamoku.
Good. Yeah. It can be a group of warriors too. Awesome. So those are a couple mana'o. Does anybody else have one? Rosalind?
Mo'olelo, the tie to Pele, the legend and the story of Pele.
Good. Mahalo. Yeah. So this thing lehua, it's not just what we see here as a flower. There's other functions too. Right? So a lehua can be something that ensnares a lover. It can ensnare a bird. It can invite conversations between trees. A lehua can also be a kalo, a type of kalo. It can be a star line. It can be the first people to fall in a battle. It can be menstruation or part of the menstruation house. It can be a flower that holds all of the water for a whole mountain and captures the water and the clouds that are coming in. And it's also the name of an island too, Alehua, which is off the coast of Niihau. Okay. And so one of the reasons I wanted to kind of broaden how we think about lehua, and I'm sure many of you know a lot of these definitions already, is for us to think about all of these things that were kind of amalgamated, combined, synthesized into that one word, lehua, right? So all of these mana'o, all of these stories are in archive, and an archive really broadly is a way to share or store data. And so there's other ways to think about it too, right? We know now, if you didn't know before, alehua is a flower. It has stories of Pele. It has the stories of warriors in Evamoku. It has the capacity to ensnare lovers. It has a capacity to hold clouds and rain. And it can also be the first menstruation, the first person to die in a battle. All of these things are archived within this term lehua. And so that is a different way and a different approach to us to thinking about how we think about archival materials or what we think an archive is. And so again, an archive is a method by which to store data. The Waihona Palapala Kahiko, or the Hawaii'i State Archives, was established in 1905. And in 1906, access was granted to the public. And this is only 8 years after the supposed Ho'ohui Aina, or the supposed annexation of Hawaii by Kauwila Republica o Hawaii, or we call them the Piki, the provisional government. And according to some researchers, the Hawaii'i State Archives is the largest indigenous archives in Mauna Kea, as well as indigenous nations of Turtle Island or present-day North America. But some people have refuted this idea. The main concept to think about here, though, is that the archives are huge. We have so many documents just in this single archive, and so many different types of materials that we've only scratched about 8% of what's been processed. And that means there's still other things that haven't been processed that aren't available to the public yet, that we haven't even read or haven't even touched. Okay, so like there's all kinds of materials, innumerable amounts of materials in the archives. So this is just a list. All of this is to say, like, there's over 4 million pages of archival materials that are written. And then there's other things like objects and private manuscripts and records, like vinyl records that are housed now at the Hawaii'i State Archives. And I just like this photo because if I was in this space, I would guarantee mop. And then, you know, after having food and having exchanges with everybody, you know they can go sleep. But it's just like a kanakatak photo that I like a lot of Kamo'i Kaua Lawa o Kamo'i Lili o Kalani. Okay, and so there's all kinds of materials in the archives. Most people know about like the written literature or I call it na kino lahi lahi, or the dainty bodies, in the same way that we write about nupepa or atikala nupepa. And the reason that we refer to them as kino lahi lahi, or dainty bodied, is because a lot of these materials are so old and dainty on paper that are sometimes disintegrating and falling apart in our hands when we scan them. Yeah, but there's other things that you can find too, like seals that will go on top of the like letters that were going out, and the girl types, which is basically how we took photos with silver gelatin prior to what is now known as like film photography. And this person over here is Lydia Paki, who later becomes known as Lydia Lili'uokalani. And this is her at 15 years old. Okay, so that's kind of an introduction into the Hawaiʻi State Archives specifically. And so the next phase that we're gonna go on to is Pehela kako e kulo ai ka aina. How do we prostrate ourselves to our aliʻi? So, kumea maʻamau, I aku ke kahikaka ōlelo, e kuno oko, e kulo oko I ka lepo. Eia mai nei ke aliʻi, eia mai nei ka lani aliʻi, eia mai nei ka aina. Yeah, so one of the things that you'll hear often by orators, especially orators in close proximity to an aliʻi, is they'll prostrate the crowd and then prostrate themselves to the chief or to the aina, what I'm referring to as an aina. And so from here on out, at least in this section, I want us to kind of think about this idea, this ōlelo no eau, he liʻi ka aina, he ka wā ke kanaka, which means the land is the chief or the king or queen, and the people are its servants or its subjects. And again, I want us to think about too, how do we prostrate ourselves to our aliʻi? Typically, when we talk about aliʻi, at least in the 19th century, when they're being introduced, the first thing that is done by an orator is to elicit a pilina, to elicit the malu of the aliʻi on top of themselves. So they're seeking the protection of the chief upon themselves. And this practice, which actually predates colonial like contact, like Kaka ōlelo are doing this prior to contact. When it comes into like written documents, they start to do the same thing with language, lyrically, as I say. And the way it makes its way into print is by looking at, if you look at Leka Hoʻopiʻi, or what are petition letters, you start to see conversations by everybody from the lowest subject to the highest chief discussing how to talk about or how to write to their moʻi. And so my favorite example that I share all the time is by this person who actually omits their name inside of a petition. And so there's this moʻolelo about keia wahine wa kapaʻia no oia o kekahi o kauhuna lepo, which means there's this wahine who wrote this petition and omits her name, and she calls herself kekahi huna lepo, which means a speck of dust or a speck of dirt. And for 10 years, this wahine was trying to contest the malu, or the protection of Kauwila Mahi, upon all of her subjects by challenging his capacity to have protection over her. And the reason that she's challenging Kauwila Mahi is because this person, Keliʻiumi, he ditched her, and basically he's a fuckboy. But one of the things that happens is that after his desertion of Kekahihuna Lepo, what happens is she has trouble for the next 10 years with her health. She no longer can afford to work. And because of these things, her life becomes very difficult. And that's why she starts to seek the protection of Kauwila during his reign. And so you can see, if we go back to the idea of Hunalepo and Aina, when she's saying she's a speck of dust or a speck of dirt in what is Kauwila, in the Aina, in the chief, she's also saying, Imana no keli'i, ikamaka ainana. Like the chief doesn't have mana unless they have the capacity to protect and to care for all of the people. In the same way, Aina can go out and protect us is the same way that we go out and protect Aina. Okay. So again, we're still on this topic of lepo. And this is actually from a mele that was dedicated to Mo'i Kalakaua during his reign. And so it's called Kalepo. And this is one of the few times where you'll actually see Kalepo Oku Ma Lawa Olono Ka Eka Loa Okane Okana Loa. So you see these four major male gods or elements, Kane, Ku, Kanaloa, and Lono, are looked at as pieces of Aina, as important to Aina, and as specks of dirt or dust. Or actually, they all have different forms, but they all are integral to Aina in the same way we think of Papa as a piece of as Aina, or the same way we think of Haumea as Aina, slightly reproducing themselves throughout the world. Okay. And so when we think about, again, how we talk to aliʻi, we also have to think about how we talk about Aina and how we relate to it, how essential we are to one another. Okay, sorry. And so one of the other things to know is that one of the ways that other people elicit through leka hoʻopiʻi or through petitions the care of an aliʻi is to say, "Owau no kekahi o kau kanaka ma kau puʻuhonua o ka lāhui." So like, you are the chief and we can only be under the protections of you, who is the puʻuhonua, or the safe space, or the safe haven, or there's so many ways to interpret puʻuhonua, but a space of refuge for all people in Hawaii. And other ways and other things that you can do with this type of knowledge or leka hoʻopiʻi, or letters that are available, is to look at how they start to prostrate themselves. Yeah, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, and talk about it in the same way that you would write to maybe your kumu. And so one of the ways that I like to hapai laho to my kumu, if I need something from them, is I say, "Ke kuno ha'aha'ane wau imo e ku'ukumu," like, I'm prostrating before you, my teacher. And then I say all the things I need to say after, aloha and small kind, like hapai laho. And then after that, after small kind, kiss posterior, I close off the letter by saying "Kikahi o kau pua." So I essentially make the claim that I am one of their students, I am one of their flowers, and because of that, not so much that they owe me, but I represent them, and so it would be of great service to them to assist me in whatever I need, right? So that's one way you can kind of, I don't know, brown nose, I think is the term in English today, how to get what you want from your kumu. I don't know. That can be kind of for some people, but if you have a pretty close relationship with them, it's a really good approach to eliciting what you need, especially when you're trying to create change alongside your kumu. And so I'm gonna move on now a little bit to art and talk about he noʻea kahulihia, or art as a motif for change. And if you don't know some of the frames and phrases for art, there's a really good Ōlelo Hawaiʻi tape where this person, Auntie Alice Namakelua, who publishes her first record at 91 years old, she says in an interview, "O ka ai hune hune pilipono me ka pilipa'a me ka maiau." These are the frames or the frameworks for talking about art in like the 20th century and the 1900s. And if you look at Mahealani Duroa, she talks about ono, the late Mahealani Duroa, as art as ono, or how like the taste, or how you have an ono for different arts. And if you look throughout the Hawaiian dictionary, you get like the phrase no'eo, but there's so many other ways that we think about art or have descriptions for art. Like, these aren't the ways that you would describe ole, right? You would use many different descriptors. One could be he onaona ka lei I ka honi aku, right? So like the fragrance of the lei is another way to talk about Hawaiian art and aesthetics. But all of these things, all of these senses play into how we talk about like a theory of change or a motif for change. And so you can take these articles, take some of the materials you see in an archive and transition them into things like video games. In one instance, I got to be part of a really amazing collective where we worked together and we shared moʻolelo to imbue the moʻolelo of Kamapua'a into the future. And if you think about Kamapua'a, he's totally like a video game boss. You get 8 eyes, and like he shoots lasers out his eyes and transforms to all kind of things. And so that's another way to think about how we can transition palapala or moʻolelo into our future, but still having it rooted inside of our past. Yeah. We can think about too, even through our struggles in the 19th century, one of the things that Kanaka often referred to was moʻolelo from the past. So you can see the Ōlelo or the struggles on Kaho'olawe for the reclamation of the island. One of the frameworks that they took is also aloha aina, right? That idea of having such an intimate relationship to the land that you can rupture and stop colonialism. You can rupture and stop the US Navy. And actually, as early as the overthrow, they already talked about aloha aina as being this very dangerous idea, this very, very dangerous concept. So much so that people who are writing into Hawaiian language newspapers, for instance, Kaikina Kelekona or Sheldon Kelekona, he is imprisoned for some of the incendiary terms that he's writing into newspapers. So he's regarded as like, in the same way that Kanafani is in Palestine, he's regarded as somebody whose weapon and is his pen, and he's a general from the newspapers, from informing people, from inciting these ideas into their mind and changing their consciousness, having a revolution of consciousness, as George Helm would say, and really shifting and promoting this idea of Hawaiian sovereignty and Hawaiian ideology inside of the moʻolelo that he's sharing. And I think some amazing examples of people who transition moʻolelo into art and things like streetwear is Whirihui. I got to work with, the name of the person I was describing is Kaikina Kelekona or Sheldon Kelekona. And yeah, so one of the amazing groups that is doing this kind of work that I've been fortunate enough to work with previously is Whirihui. And one of the moʻolelo that we tried to transition into a whole collection is a moʻolelo of Kakuhi Hewa on Oahu. And so we took motifs from the moʻolelo, shared a little bit about the moʻolelo of Kakuhi Hewa, and then took motifs from and art and aesthetics from the Islanders logo, from baseball technologies that were around in the 20th century. But also one of the underlying things that we didn't share with everybody is the Cartwright, the person who introduces baseball to the world, is actually a really close friend of Kalakaua. And actually he becomes part of or an assistant of the cabinet or the Ahakuka Malu or the Privy Council when he resides in Hawaii. And that's why Hawaii is one of the first places in the world to have baseball. And actually, if you go to Nu'uanu Cemetery and you go to his grave is there, and you can tell it's his grave because it's really tall, but get baseballs everywhere around it, or people give their ho'okupu, right? Or people give their offerings to the wailua of that person of Cartwright. And Kalakaua was actually the first person of like a royal stature, or like a king, a president, or anyone or along those lines to see a baseball game live. And he sees it in Boston as he's on his trip all around the world, right? His Makahiki circuit around the world. Yeah, Cartwright Field in Makiki. And so other ways we can do these or bring these materials into a future and preserve our future and advance our future rooted in our past is by things like music. And so one of these mele that I got to do with Rexy and the Rally Round band is we got to share a little bit about what her goal was and what her intentions were with her mele. And based off of that, I got to curate kind of what the imagery surrounding her looked like, starting off with the Aina where she's from, Kalihi, talking a little bit about the moʻolelo of Haumea with her, and then giving images as her like starting point for Kalihi, and then transitioning into how mele has played a pivotal role in specifically resistance against America throughout the 19th century and the 20th century, so the 1800s and the 1900s, and still continues to be one of the ways where we come to the front lines of fighting for our air in Hawaii today. And so now I'm gonna share a little bit of a story related to Kamehameha, and one of the nicknames that Kamehameha develops, which is called Amamalua. And so Amamalua is like a double sacrifice, or like a double dedication. And so the words in ōlelo are e kaumaha ana no o kiwala o ina alana mua, me ka pau ole ka molia ana a leila e hopo iho ana o Kamehameha ia I makakoloa a mamakula I ke akua anoa a ela. And so what happens is they're dedicating, or kiwala o is dedicating the first sacrifice, and before it's even done, Kamehameha the first, he grabs I makakoloa and sacrifices at the same time, and makes the god no longer belong to Kiwala'o. And then afterwards it says, Apau ka lawa hai ana, a leila, hoi ia ke kino, make a Kiwala'o, me ka mana'o, o e, wa amama mua ia e ke la maukolohe, a pela I kapa iai o amamalua. Yeah, so after the first sacrifice is made, the body that was dedicated, like, which is I makakoloa, by Kamehameha, is given to Kiwala'o, pretty much to say, you no more mana here anymore. And after that first sacrifice and this like rascal behavior, that is the way that Kamehameha the first got this name, Amamalua, which is a name that isn't typically used or referred to in regards to Kamehameha Pai'ea anymore. And kind of to expand on this name, I realized after reading this mo'olelo that this is a ceremony and this is an action, and the type of action it is a seizure of power, right? So in the same way that Kiwala'o is dedicating things to his akua in order to become the top dog on Hawaii Island, Kamehameha usurps this at the same time and gives a sacrifice at the same time, right, of same value or of equal value. Yeah. And so this type of ceremony, Amamalua, is a ceremony for overthrowing the type of power that is in place at the moment by dedicating things in the same way that the other place is dedicating their ho'okupo or their alama. But you cannot just, that was just a theory or an idea. And the way to consecrate an idea is by finding more mo'olelo, which mention this thing, Amamalua. Okay, and so I found some evidence of it in the mo'olelo of Makalei, which happens inside of Kawainui, which is part of Kailua Oahu. And this is actually walks through the ceremony and what has to happen for the ceremony to occur. And so they say, Makau kau ka ipo kiloloni o lono opua, kau I ka neve neve. E kua I ka papahuli honua, a ku ka ai moku. Ki ko oi holo ka lima o Haumea I loko o ke poi, a pi kula I ka vai, I na maka o ka hinihini ula, me ka hua ōlelo I ka waha. O ku'i, a ho alo o ka eno kiloloni, o ka hale pā ula o Amamalua. Right, and so what happens is this person, Kahinihini Ula, which is the younger brother of Kamapua, who I mentioned earlier, that pig demigod, he's trying to learn how to do ceremony. And the way that he learns ceremony is actually from his grandmother, who is Haumea. And one of the things that Haumea does after teaching Hina, how to do the ceremony is she dips her fingers inside the poi, inside of a umeke poi, goes like this, which is like a P, inside of the water, inside of the eyes of Kahini Huni Ula. And as she's chanting, she says, "Okuya ho'ala ka enakiloni," which is one of the ways that we look at star lines or learn how to understand star lines. And then looking at these other names and other phrases. And Kahalepa Ula is actually like the red glow of Kilauea. And Amamalua, again, is that double sacrifice that Kamehameha did, but it's a traditional ceremony. And I'll talk a little bit more about this particular chant in a second. But one of the things that happens is iku, or it's actualized, and it goes into Halepo'i Ohane, which is like the spiritual realm, spiritual house. And they start to name the places where this Amamalua can take place. And they actually name the nights of the Malama, or the nights of the month that the ceremony needs to occur, right? And so it's two couple nights belonging to the Kauwila ceremony, which is a ceremony for activating ki'i. And it's a couple for ku and a couple for hua. And so if you know moon calendar, the Kauwila Mahi, as we say today, but the Malama praxis, then you know when you have to do this ceremony. Okay. And so, okay. One way we can take images, right? So we can take that mo'olelo of Kamehameha, that nickname Amamalua, and transition it into things like clothing, right? And so there's other mo'olelo. We know the mo'olelo of Kepanivai. I know my Maui Kumu is here and doesn't like that I'm talking about this mo'olelo because they don't like Kamehameha because they rep Maui super hard. But this really famous battle, Kepanivai, happens. And one of the ways that we can relay this mo'olelo and get more people to learn this mo'olelo is through things like streetwear. And so this is actually a collab between Fitted Hawaii and Pai'era Projects. And what's amazing to me about this collab was when I was first learning, like this actually dropped in the same time that I started doing research at the Hawaii'i State Archives. And when it came out, I was kind of not looking for a way to share mo'olelo outside of ways that I had been trying to do it already. Like it wasn't enough for me to just go to class and learn inside of one classroom and everything's inside of the classroom. This was kind of an alternative. They're learning these deep dives on mo'olelo, especially to Kamehameha and his conquest across the Hawaiian Islands. But the case in this particular case, Kepanivai, or the damming of the waters, what happens, right? They start to share the mo'olelo through Pai'era Projects and through Fitted about Lopaka, one of the cannons that Kamehameha names, and how it's spewing out cannons or cannonballs and literally damming the flow of the water from Iao into basically Wailuku, or Maui's Wailuku, because there's Wailuku on most islands. And so one of the things that happens, right, is when you start to do things outside of what is typical of archival material, when you start to teach in your lahui, when you do things like mele, when you do things like streetwear, especially when you do things like art, you start to relay these mo'olelo to people who weren't even ready, right? So you komomalu, or like you guerrilla attack kind of their consciousness and get them interested in these things. Because to me, aole ka ho'okuluma ka panen no ka ho'okuluma ana, right? Like normalization isn't the answer to normalization. You gotta make it cool for it to become normal. So one of the things that we can do, right, is go through things like, you know, this collaboration by Pai'era Projects and Fitted, where they relay this mo'olelo of Kamehameha and Maui, but making it accessible to people who may have never engaged with this mo'olelo if they had never heard of this streetwear brand, right? So you can surreptitiously access a whole different crowd of people when you work outside of what is like the typical classroom. And so one of the things that we're gonna do now is called Ho'alu'i Nakini, or gathering the multitudes. And so what we're gonna do is actually, I'm going to share a little bit about how to actually do the research inside of the new Hawaii State Archives website. And then you're going to look at one or two materials. We're going to play a really quick game. And then I'm going to kind of help out how to do these research processes and kind of walk through how to do research at the Hawaii State Archives. And so I want to remind everybody that sharing moʻolelo has always been an organizing principle for our Kanaka. This palapala actually comes from 1853. It's from the aliʻi, which is a smallpox epidemic, which happens in 1853, which was actually started or invited in by Lima Ikaika, Lawa Okauka, which are Armstrong and Judd, right? Two of these ancestors of the people for the overthrow. And there's just really one of my favorite letters in these petitions that happened in 1853, where they say, this person, Waimalu, who's actually from Waianae and is a priest over there, he starts to write a little bit of, he starts referencing moʻolelo in order to contest and to get Armstrong and Judd to stay in their positions in the Ahakuka Malu. And so he says, Namo I kamehameha e kolu, ke aliʻi o ko Hawaii paʻaina, aloha oe, o mākou no kau po e kaua nei, nā no, I can't see, inoa makelia palapa loihi, right? So he's just kind of prostrating himself, right? Again, we see we see those kind of frameworks are in already that beginning of that letter. And all throughout this letter and this petition, they say, they talk about a little bit about the moʻolelo surrounding the time of Hua and when famine is happening inside of Hawaii. And then there's this ōlelo noʻeau that's referenced inside of the palapala, which is koele naivi o Hua ikala, or dry are the bones of Hua in the sun. And then they go on to reference this small little ōlelo noʻeau related to Kakui Heva and how umikamano, umikalau, and then kini kailua mano kane ohe. So 40,000 in kailua and 4,000 in kane ohe were the like people that were dying when Waikiki was a capital. Okay? And because of ma'ioku'u, which is like the pestilent disease that was introduced by the West. So again, petitions and even in these new forms of 19th century contestation, our ancestors in that 19th century, they turned to mo'olelo, they turned to mele, they turned to ōlelo noʻeau in order to create change. They didn't just leave these things behind. And I think one of the most valuable things we can learn from that century is that in order to stop colonialism, imperialism, and to take power back from the colonialist like frameworks that were starting to move in and impede and encroach on Hawaii, they turn to these things, they turn to the mo'olelo, they turn to all of these concepts from their kupuna in order to contest them. And I think that is one of the most valuable things from the 19th century, from the Hawaiian Kingdom, that we should value today as well. Right? We should do the same things they did. We should find these pockets of mo'olelo, these kau, these mele, these ōlelo noʻeau that really ingrain us into our mo'olelo, into who we were before colonialism, so that we can have those same elements after the colonists had left. Okay. And so I'm gonna walk through the process of accessing materials when you come into the Hawaii State Archives. And so this is a records request. You're not gonna use this unless you're actually in person, but basically you would write the series number, folder number, and a short description of what that thing is that you're trying to access, right? Which doesn't really make sense until we do this. And so I'm gonna show you two things. Okay. Let me see. So we'll go through this one first. And so this is actually the digital archives, and I'm going to drop it in the chat. And so this is the website where you can actually access everything that's available online right now. And the reason that this is amazing is I like to call it like Hawaiian Google, where there's almost too much information available. So let's say I want to look up, oh yeah, I'm sorry, it's in Ōlelo Hawaiʻi and English. I did a lot of the translations for the Ōlelo Hawaiʻi, and they were approved by Jason Kapena Achu, who's been a translator at the Hawaiian State Archives for the last 40 years. First person to say, what is something you want to search up? Person, place, event, anything.
Kuluwai Maka.
Uluwai Maka. Ooh. Okay. So look, these are the things, are the records that we have related to Kuluwai Maka, right? We don't have a lot. We just have the name index card, kind of a little bit about who they are, right? Super limited, which is junk. Compared to Bishop Museum, who actually has most of the recordings of Kuluwai Maka, Kapi Henui Palea, and the chants that he's written down. Do you have another person, event, or subject that you'd like to look up? I know that wasn't a lot, yeah.
How about Aua
Okay, so I'm gonna show you now like the pilikia kind of how the website is and why I called it like Hawaiian Google. And so if you look up Aua, right, what happens is the archives will look up more terms than like the phrase. It's not gonna just give you the phrase Aua, comma, like the whole mele. It's gonna pick apart what it wants to see, which is Aua, Kalei Aua, right? And so you're not getting the mele. I think it's the mele that you're trying to reference. And so that's one of the issues with how much material exists in the Hawaii State Archives, right? We can't get super simple, concrete, I need to look at this, I need to look at that mele, and get like translations right away from this resource. But there is a resource that I know has it. And so I'm gonna share this one too inside of the chat. Sorry, I'm gonna stop sharing real quick. Okay. And so this is actually where we keep most of the manuscript collections. So the things that haven't been scanned, the things that haven't been digitized yet, and kind of way more things than people know exist. And because I know, because I've looked it up before too, I'm gonna scroll down to one particular manuscript collection, which is a Theodore Kelsey collection. Okay. So Theodore Kelsey, he's a settler who actually comes from the PNW, the Pacific Northwest, moves to Hawaii and becomes basically somebody who transcribes moʻolelo and mele. And he sits around with like some amazing people who are kind of the beginning of the Hawaii State Archives and the beginning of translations, right? So you can already see he's cruising with Kuluwai Maka, who you mentioned. He does translations of Kumulipo. He's cruising with Kekahuna, who's one of my favorite people. And I'll go down. But you can look through these things like manuscript collections and you can access them by coming in. So this is the series number, what I mentioned earlier, and the box number would be this, and then you can put the folder number. But collections like Theodore Kelsey's are so large that we need more people to scan them, or we need more funding actually. Not me directly, but like it'd be amazing to have all of these materials scanned, right? And have all of these mele. Actually, what's interesting too about Theodore Kelsey is he starts to draft his own dictionary based on mele, with how other people are starting to talk about mele, talk about other ideas revolving around specific mele. So he's talking story with Kuluwai Maka. He's talking story with Davida Malo Kupihea, which isn't related to the same David Malo. And then he's talking story with Henry Enoka Palinepa. And so, yeah, he's talking story with all of these different people, but you can see that a lot of these mele are drafted inside of his collection, and almost all of his, he translates them. So you can look at this akua, Wakea Kahiko Luamea, which most people don't know is like one of the ancestors of Wakea. Kahiko Luamea is one of the, like really, really old. And they have a little bit of information, and they actually note who the informant was of that particular like moʻolelo for that particular draft of that mana of that moʻolelo. So that portion of the story that's being relayed, right? So you can see, I think you pretty much got to go through, right? Which is actually still choke information. And so you can already see like we're getting into the hundreds in folder numbers. And if you think about it more briefly, just this collection and alone, the Kelsey collection, there's 540 folders, and there's between 8 to 100 pages for each folder. So you can get between, you know, you're getting up to 10,000 or more pages of material just from this one person. Okay, so that's how big and how vast the things that exist at the archives are. I'm actually gonna go to another one I think I showed earlier, which is the one I referenced, which is Kekahuna. Scroll down. And I'm only going to show you because he has cool drawings. And so Henry Enoka Kekahuna is actually from Hana, Maui. And as we know, Hana is one of those last mainstay places of culture, just like Ka'u is on Hawaii Island, for Ike being preserved, for advancing our traditions. And, you know, actually, if you look at all the pu'u inside of that aina, that's almost always a last stand for Maui Island in most cases. But yeah, this guy, Henry Enoka Palinepa Kekahuna, one of my favorite people. He's the first person in the 19th century, or like in the 20th century to do drawings around heiau. So he starts to chart how many ili or how many puhaku or how many ko'a are inside of a heiau. He starts to draw out the boundaries of heiau, and almost all these things that he notes inside of his folders, inside of his manuscripts, he has drawings for, right? And the one I mentioned earlier is Lua. And so I'm going to say the M445, which is the manuscript name, and it's box 4 and folder 72. Oh, sorry, not the liquor, but that one's important too. If you like, go check them out, get the recipes for ōlelo, get traditional beers made with uala. But maybe we'll focus on Lua for today. And so, yeah, just remember that for a second. And then I'll show you what it looks like. Okay. And then we'll go back to the other archives page and how to access things through there. And so this is actually one of the drawings of Kekahuna related to Lua. And so there's this illusion, right, that we have Lua kind of doesn't exist anymore. All the Lua traditions have faded and only a couple kumu or olohe have the information. But Kekahuna was actually becoming an olohe Lua, trained in all of it and documented all of it and started to do drawings. And so one of my favorite drawings related to Lua is actually this one right here. And when you uniki, you have to put your arms out straight across, and the person has to walk all the way across you without your arms falling down or without you moving your body. And that's part of the uniki process for olohe Lua. And that's one of the things that he drew. And so we already know, right? There's so much mo'olelo, so much materials related to things within the Hawaiian State Archives that we haven't even touched us. Well, we're at the surface. We're just jumping in the water. We never really get to do deep dives yet. Right? And this is just one image and one manuscript that already kind of shatters how some people think about Lua today. So I'm going to go back to how to access things digitally. So this is the first link I dropped. I'm gonna explain it more in detail how to use it, right? Again, this is actually way too much information. Yeah, too much, like too much things to look at. Okay, so the better way to do it is to go on to Makaʻikaʻi in Hawaiian. In English, it's browse. And these are all collections that are available through the Hawaiʻi State Archives. But what I'm gonna focus on is this one, the Hawaiʻi State Archives. And honestly, you can look at the other things too. I just choosing Hawaiʻi State Archives because it's so big and because I know it really well. And I'll say in English, but these are the ways that you can access what's available online. And so for the photograph collection, things are being updated every 2 weeks. So every time that we scan roughly 2,000 photos, there will be a new upload, a new folder of materials related to photographs. And then you can go through. So I clicked on photographs. I'm gonna look at Brother Bertram's and then just choose a glass plate negative and you go into the box. So these references are so you can use them if you want to develop your own research. You have the reference number for reference names. Water apples, junk the photo. See, so not all photos are amazing, but I know which ones are. Actually, we'll do that in a second. So this is, again, kind of how to access photos. Go to George Bacon, can look up things like, I'll go through airlines, airports. And then, look, you can look at photos of this airline and yeah, lovely hula hands. That's all I'm going to say. Okay. But now I'm going to go back to browse, which is the original. Go back down to the second page, or you can actually change here to 50, but I usually just do this because it's faster. Go to Hawaiʻi State Archives. And what you really want to look at, aside from the manuscripts, which I mentioned earlier, is the finding aids. So you can go to the indexes and finding aids, and then you can go either by subject or name. And what we'll do is we'll go by name. And this process you can use so you can access like the name Inoa Kupuna if you're doing genealogy research. Even if you're not doing genealogy research, you like learn more about a certain person. For instance, I don't know, somebody like Hilo Hari. Sometimes their nickname will show up over here, sometimes it won't, but you'll see sometimes even alternate spellings of people that you're researching or things related or materials related to that family. Okay. So again, there's so much information. Right? This one person has 144 pages of index cards, and like the actual page will probably be like a full page, but you would ask for this would be what you would write down on that paper that I showed earlier. But what's good about these things like name index cards and subject index cards is you can learn a little bit about what you're trying to access before you access it. And so I'll just go subject, I don't know, I'll just choose any kind already. Page 7. Haleo Keawe. Oh no. That was pretty lucky. And so you can see, right? So these are the things that we have at the archives available that are accessible right now and how to access them. So you'd write these things down, but sometimes they are already online. And so what we're gonna do is press browse again. I know it's actually easier to keep tabs than to like keep pressing it, but I just want to keep showing you so you get used to it. And you can go through microfilms, which are already digitized. And it's the same thing as publication. So if you want to look at particular Atikala Nupepa, and you know the name of the Nupepa, that's microfilmed. Some of them aren't on Papakilo. You can go down to, I'm gonna go to Kealoha. And then on the second half, right, you scroll down, you have 553 pages of Atikala from Kealoha. Right, so you can read through in that way. Pretty, yeah. But I think one of the best things, again, I've said how to access newspapers, photos, subject, and name index is just going through and reading some of the index cards, because you can actually learn a really large amount by looking at those. And then this, oh my gosh. This is actually the project that I've been working on for the past 3 years, which are the numbered documents, cron files, good kind cron, and then the chronological files from 1850 to 1900. Yeah, so basically everything related to governmental bodies, how to write into your aliʻi, how to have exchanges or petition your aliʻi, how people organized in the 1800s are inside of these files. And what you really want to look at is this one, the FONEX series 72. And it's actually, I'll click show 50. And it goes by box. And so it shows the beginning of that box, and then it goes down to whatever time frame that you wanted to look at. I'm gonna choose box 6, and I'll go down. So it has the English names for these things, right? The Privy Council. And now this is another way that you can learn the terminology that exists revolving around these 19th century governmental bodies. You just select the language and then you press Ōlelo Hawaiʻi, and boom, you get them in Ōlelo Hawaiʻi, right? And so now the English one is Privy Council, but in Ōlelo Hawaiʻi is the Ahakuka Malu. And all of these terms, all of these they're not interpretations, they're translations, because these are the words of the governmental body within that day, right? So you can make it a hard, like, this is the name of the government body, this is the name of that organization, this is the name of this or that in that time period. Okay. And I'll just show you an example of what that looks like. So in this folder, it just has 72, but you can download it as a PDF over here. And then one of the things that you can do, right? So again, some of it is kino lahi lahi, like some of it is falling apart. Some of it is closed off to, it's not easily accessible, but you can still look at these things. It's easier to download and like zoom in to see exactly the words of a person when they're writing a petition. I've seen petitions by David Marlowe asking for some of his land back from the government because they went like, put too much on top of, like the roads were building too much inside of in Lahaina. So he's like calling them out. And like, that's the first time I've seen David Marlowe so sassy. And so, I don't know, you can really look at so many different types of things. But what I think is really important about this FONEX series, which I've been really intimate with in the last 3 years, is that you can look at what your kupuna were engaging in politically, not just inside of Nupepa, right? For instance, let's go, let me find it. Okay. So if I wanted to look at Napio Kalai Aina, which is in English, the political prisoners. Oh man, it would do that. What would happen is I can go onto this, right? I can look at who are all the prisoners after the 1895 Kawakuloko, or what is called the 1895 Wilcox Rebellion, why they were arrested, why they were deported, what actions were taking place. And not just that, you can see the purchases that were made, what type of life they were living inside of their cells. And you can really get into the nitty gritty of why did this, these Americans that sometimes call themselves Hawaiian nationals that helped to, that constructed the overthrow of moʻolelo Okalani, and figure out what the hell was wrong with them. But you can also see how your kupuna were interacting with these people. And again, like the point of the Hawaiʻi State Archives is to give access to the public to their own records, to their own stories, so that you can use these moʻolelo to radicalize your family, to radicalize the people around you. So there's only one more thing that I wanted to do. And so if you want to go to the first link I dropped, I want to play a little game with you guys. And this is called Ki'i Quest. And so these are your 3 search terms that you're going to put in the top search bar that I showed earlier. And so this first one is mo'i kalakaua. This will be your search term. The second one is hula. And the third one is Hawaiian Airlines. So this first picture of mo'i kalakaua will be within the first 5 pages of photos. The second one with hula will be in the last 3 pages of hula. And this Hawaiian Airlines one will, I think, is in the first page of Hawaiian Airlines. So I'm going to send you guys on a Ki'i Quest. I want to make sure that you guys actually know how to like search and research through the Hawaiʻi State Archives. So I'll give you guys maybe 5 minutes to go through and kind of check those things out.
Found the second one.
Amazing, yeah. Yeah, this is one of my favorite ones. Lili Okalani. I think it's in 1903, 1904 maybe. And she's watching hula in Waikiki. And they're actually performing. Yeah, anyway. This is a photo of the place where I'm from, Kohelepelepe, what is now known as Mauna Lua. And if you guys remember earlier, that person, Joseph Kanepu'u, he's actually writing that letter that he sends in to Kapihenui in that newspaper, Ōlelo Hawaiʻi, from this spot right here, from that spot, and he's writing it into basically over here. And so I like to remind everyone that Mauna Lua is the way older name for what is now known as Hawaii Kai, where I'm from. But yeah. Yeah. So I'll give you guys a couple more minutes to kind of search through. And again, sometimes you'll see images, especially images that have different colors and different shades of the original, because they're like reprints. So as you guys are looking, I can only hope that you're annoyed by my voice by now. But one of the things that's really exciting about this new website is how accessible it is in comparison to how really slow the old Hawaiʻi State Archives website was. Like finding one of these photos before would probably take at least 2 hours and then maybe like 10 minutes for one of them to load. So this new update is really exciting, and it's really about creating access again for the public to learn their moʻolelo better, to learn your moʻoku oho and have it pa'a. But not just those things, to know our intellectual genealogies, know more intimately about the scholars we read about. Like it's one thing to read about Kamakau and the things he's writing into newspapers. It's another thing to read about how much poi he's eating in a day, right? So all of these things are part of like the governmental body and things that are being written in petitions. And so that's what's really exciting about this. Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to navigate but the more you do it, the more accessible, the easier it gets. Okay, so I'm gonna stop the Ki'i Quest for now. Hope some of you found some of them. Did anybody find all of them? No. Okay. Nice. Okay. Oh, sorry, 1 second. Okay. So now I'm gonna shift us back a little bit to how we can use these moʻolelo, how we can use these archival materials into political organizing. Yay. Okay. So aside from the things that you've seen, right, the best way I think to think about organizing is to looking at mele, right? And mele as contestation, mele as an archive and organization of people, mele as a way of organizing all the bodies that are within that mele, right? So with a mele, you can learn what is the political structure of that place in a day, what are the triumphs of the aina, how intimate, maybe more than we need to know sometimes in aliʻi are with each other, how big somebody's maʻi is. If you look at maʻi, ula maʻi, you can learn all these things through mele, right? And these are like really fun things to do. I don't know. I'm not somebody that just read mele maʻi. Like that's not my version of pornography. It's just having an exchange with your ancestors in a way that you can organize around it. And so what I'm gonna share with you is a little bit about organizing through this idea of sense and how we talk about the body. And I'm gonna think about it through this one limu, the limu lipua a'ala o kalehua vehe, which is one specific limu and one specific place. And kalehua vehe is one specific surf break inside of Waikiki. Okay. Okay. So Waikiki, as we know today, is one of the most hotly contested places between Kanaka and tourists. And you can kind of see things that are occurring within the aina are the same things that are occurring within our poe, right? And you see these things in mele, like easy way to think about it as the land and the people as the same is from mele kamahualele, which is done by kamahualele as he's chanting in, and they're coming up across the archipelago, eventually to Mo'ikeha, sitting and residing, as a chief inside of Kauai. But before they even say land, before they even see land, they say, Eia Hawaii, he moku, he kanaka Hawaii, he kanaka Hawaii, right? Here's Hawaii, a land, a people, a Hawaiian people indeed, or it is Hawaii indeed, right? So again, we get all of these ideas, all of these things that I talked about earlier. The land is a people, one person is a speck of dust, all of that can be consolidated into 2 lines, right? Or you can even make it simpler. Like that's 1 line. You can say all those things in 1 line, right? But when we think about Waikiki, when we think about what's occurring there, it's another thing to think about what my favorite limu of that place, which is again the limu lipua a'ala o kalehua vehe, right? And so that is a specific limu. It has a specific scent and a very specific taste. And so what I'm gonna do and talk about it as a political body is by starting with its mo'olelo from the mo'olelo of Hi'iaka Ikapoliopele. So after Hi'iaka Ikapoliopele goes on her trip to save the dummy Lohi'au for her older sister Pele, Honuamea Pele, what happens is they're on their way back. When they come to Waikiki, they see Pele'ula, a really beautiful young chief, and Hi'iaka's like, Shmin, I like check him out. And so one of the things that starts to happen is she starts to draw comparisons to Pele'ula, and she actually makes this song, oh my gosh, the Melele that some people know, like Kele Maila Oka Ula Ike Kaye. That's actually where that song is composed. She's in Hi'iaka is in Kalehua Vehe. She's staring at Pele'ula and she sees their beauty. And after seeing this beauty, she makes this song. Okay? The very next paragraph in this version of Ōlelo Mahi here, 1906 version of Hi'iaka Ikapoliopele, they talk about this lipua, this limu lipua a'ala o kalehua vehe, how it dances inside of the water, how it's one of the best tasting limu in all of Hawaii. And what happens next his Pele Ula invites Lohi'au and Hi'aka Ikapolio Pele to play a game of Kilu, which is a game of courtship for chiefs and elemental gods, Akua. And the one for commoners is called Pa'ume. And so what happens is they're playing this game. Lohi'au's trying, he's trying, but he's really living up to his name, Lohi'au. He's really not good at that game. So Hi'aka starts to sing that chant that she said again. Kele Maila Oka'ula. But this time she starts to relay a little bit about that Limu Lipua. And after she starts to relay a little bit about the Limu Lipua, then finally Lohi'au kind of gets it. And Lohi'au's still a little bit slow, but that's kind of his jams. And what starts to happen is this mele that's composed for Pele Ula becomes actualized and becomes a thing that we can organize around, in my opinion. And so first time we see this mele, right, is in this time of Hi'aka Ikapolio Pele. We see it start to pop up in mele and in moʻolelo all throughout the 19th century or the 1800s, right? So it's still there. It's enduring even with all of these impediments, even with all the colonialist bodies that are starting to move into Kalehuawehe and Waikiki. And actually, Waikiki is still a very hard place, a stronghold in Oahu. Other places throughout Oahu are kind of starting to be colonized by the West. Right outside of Waikiki, right in Honolulu, is one of those places where that occurs. Right. After the overthrow, we look at the 20th century, like the 1900s. This mele or this limu is still being talked about in mele. And they talk about it being so fragrant, so tasty that from Kalehuawehe all the way through to the top of Kapahulu, which is like right near Kaimuki area, like to those mountains, almost to Le'ahi, almost to like Diamond Head, Kaimanahila, Laiahi, whatever you like call them. This fragrance is still crawling through, and it persists and endures. Right. And so again, this is the 19th century. There's this mele that most people know today, but it's a remix, right? Most people know the remix of Waikiki Hula, which is actually composed by Jonah Kuhio Kalaniana Ole. And he writes this mele about the Lipua, and he compares his lover to the Lipua. So another way to think about more broadly, on the 25th anniversary, on their 25th anniversary of marriage, as he's writing this mele for his pakana, and he's comparing her to the Lipua, he's already kind of gone through the US. He's already gone to Montreal. He's already gone to all these other places. And like, he's a fox. Like, people are hitting on him left and right. They're like trying to get with him. And this pakana starts to get worried. The Limu Lipua starts to get worried a little bit. And so that Limu Lipua that he's writing the mele about, he compares this Limu Lipua to all of these famous flowers from other places that have made their way to Hawaii that are really pretty to look at, but they stink and they're not tasty in the same way the Limu Lipua is, right? And so we can again think about the Limu Lipua and how it's getting worried a little bit about the relationship that it's having with the Po'e Oiwi o Kelawai, with the indigenous people of that space. Now, when we look at the 20th century, very few people have made mele about the Limu Lipua A'ala o Kalehuawehe. I think I only know 2 mele that have been composed about it, specifically for the Waikiki one. I'm sure there may be other Limu Lipua in other mele, but I think one of the things that we can do, right, by knowing these mo'olelo, by knowing this archive of this Limu Lipua, is make like the Limu Lipua. We can take these fragrances, crawl through Waikiki, go against the colonial bodies, and in spite of the colonists coming in spite of the tourists coming in spite of all of these coming in, we can be like that Lipua. We can endure all of these things, but the way for us to win is to make more Lipua there. It's not to just say, oh, I'm here. So the way we do that is by getting all of these archival materials, looking at these things like the mele, organizing around it, and making our own mele about it. And so one of the things that we can do to contribute in order to organize around defending this limu lipua alo kalehua vele vehe is to think about all these things that we love in our aina and how they relate to us. So for me, scent was like the thing that I remember for this limu lipua, and I can organize around that. I love this limu lipua. One example could be if you love your tutu, maybe she has like her favorite food that she makes, and you love that scent, or maybe she has a favorite flower she plants. Is that idea, that type of love that you want to have for your aina, and that's the thing you want to organize around. And so you start to see those types of things go in to all the places that you need to be. So hula and mele continue to be one of the places where contestation took place pre-contact. It continued to be that way in the 1990s, and it continued, like, even became one of the ways where we contested to ensure a culture, to ensure the bodies in the aina still had protection. And even up until today, you can still think about lehua, lipua as an archive of ways that we can organize, and not just ways that we can organize to create people power, and not just to resist, but to ensure that our organization is rooted in the past. Imea e olai ka wakaiko. Oe wale no. Mahalo. Okay. Anybody have questions? I think I talked long time. Okay.
I don't think we have any questions, but mahalo nui. That was awesome.
Oh, mahalo ne.
Yeah, that was the best way to end today. So mahalo.
Cool. Yeah. And if anybody has questions, you can email me, dmahi@hawaii.edu. If you need to access this video, I think we'll be posting it online later, hopefully. And yeah, I think that's everything. If not, mahalo nui ya oko no kahiki ana mai, ka awai aulu ana mai. Email dmahi@hawaii.edu. I'm very slow at replying to my emails, just so you know. I'm gonna warn you now, but I will. Yeah, even the person who organized this agrees. So yeah, please let me know. But I will get to it eventually. I'm just not really quick with it. But again, I hope that you all learned a little bit about the Hawaiian State Archives, what we're doing, and I hope you can all get access to it. Yeah, and spark the revolution of consciousness in your aina.